I'm here with James Kourtides, who is in the Tampa Bay area, someone I've gotten to know in recent times because of his shared interest that we share about philosophy and the work of Rene Girard and some of the other disciplines that are touched by the conversations around critical theory. So thanks for joining me, James.
David, thank you. Thanks for taking the time, and I appreciate connecting with you.
Yeah, now you recently came on, you made a surprise cameo appearance on my radio program, A Neighbor's Choice. I think I gave you a 10-minute head start. I don't remember what it was, but this just makes for fun radio to see if people want to dive in and have a conversation, and you did great. But I've been seeing you on your YouTube channel that you've been posting a read-through of I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and I've been following
I just finished the book, actually, so.
So, and from my conversations with you and the way you've expressed, you've had some profound things to consider in the work of Rene Girard's I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. I recommend that book as a great introduction to Girard's work. When someone asks me, because I get this a lot, people asking me, okay, how do I get into Girard? I'm ready to get in. And I tell them, go watch the 5-part CBC radio series of him. It's a 5-hour interview series, 1 hour each part. And that's with David Cayley, who we've had on the radio show recently. And David Cayley interviews Girard and gives you the full sweep of his theory. And I tell people, watch that and then go read I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. That's your great introduction. So you just finished I See Satan. You've engaged Girard before, but just tell me your overall, what was the profound, insights that you're still stirring around with, having read the book just recently?
Yeah, definitely. I read through it, and as I started reading it, it just came to me. I'm like, I need to share this. I want to read this on my YouTube channel, and that's kind of why I started doing it. And just his theory, his overall theory of mimetic desire, of the founding murder, through the history of civilizations, through the whole mythic constructions of religion, and how Christianity kind of short-circuited that. It satisfied an intellectual kind of craving that I had that matched my theological intentions in terms of Christianity. I had a moment, especially in chapter 14, where I was like, there was just one moment where I was like, just became Christian, which sounds weird because I was in a sense, but it was just that I had just this moment, which was very interesting. And I think, my upbringing, I studied a lot of critical theory and philosophy in college and then after college. And I found, his critique of where we're at, given the recent phenomena that are happening in our society and our culture, especially here in America, his critique of Freud and Nietzsche and Marx, it kind of popped the light bulb on my head because I've been reading those folks for a while. And, his understanding of how Nietzsche short-circuited or understood the Christian short-circuiting of the scapegoat mechanism and how profound of an effect that has on stopping the mimetic, the scapegoating process, and how that related to his thought through Girard's words was profound. I'm still having trouble articulating it, actually.
Well, and there's a lot of different ways to approach it and explain it because but one of the most fundamental levels, I think, is that, once you see that human beings are, we're hardwired by our humanity to desire things and to copy things that other people have and desire, right? So we borrow the desires of those around us, which if you do not hold on to almost arbitrary differentiation, when you copy everything that everybody else is doing around you, you can lose your mind. You know what I mean? You can lose your mind. Now, an example of this would be like the copycat game that people play on the playground. You say something, somebody else says something, right? And they don't stop. At some point, it makes you go crazy. It's like, all right, enough. You don't want to hear the same thing echoed back at you over and over again. And so there's this built-in protection that we put in our social relationships, wherein we elevate differentiation and boundaries in order to prevent the madness of runaway undifferentiation, right? So if we're all copying each other, it's going to lead to a loss of a sense of self. So when we look at our neighbors, we perceive that they have things that are wholly different from things that we have, right? In reality, most of the things that we see our neighbors having that we think are distinct from our being are not really truly different. They're not truly that far off from us. But because they're in the possession of our neighbor and we are not our neighbors, we covet the difference that we see in our neighbor that is modeled by the object that they have, right? So if it's a car, if it's a status, if it's a slickness with talent or words or money or victim status like we have in the West, there's this constant desire to see that the neighbor has something wholly different that I need to attain. And then the more you copy that, the more you're frustrated by the thought that, well, for whatever reason, my neighbor seems farther apart than ever. But from a third-party observer, you look more alike than ever, right? And so it's those arbitrary differences. As two people come in close contact, it starts to breed friction, you know? But from the third-party perspective outside of these two individuals, they look closer than ever. But within the person's perspective, the friction of being attracted and repelled looks like they're farther apart than ever, but it's almost like it's an attempt for the human to mask over how similar we all are and how similar we are to our rival. And I think one of the things that you see with the scapegoat mechanism is it's an attempt to, when that mimetic undifferentiation starts spiraling out of control so long, it creates a possession, what we call crowd psychology or a hive mind or groupthink, herd mentality. All those are interchangeable, I guess, to some degree. And it creates this contagion of undifferentiation. And so it's almost like in a sea of sameness, that blob of humanity needs to consume difference in order to maintain its sanity, in order to maintain its existence, right? If everybody's so undifferentiated, the hunchback, the dwarf, the prom queen, the witch, the rich king, the minority, the old king, whatever, has to have a perceived differentiation that in a sea of sameness, everybody can latch onto and try to consume that marker of difference as an antidote to the insanity of being in an undifferentiated state of loss of self. So it's in order to maintain oneself, one's sense of self, as a collective, one needs to work as a board to consume a marker of difference in order to maintain a little. It's almost like a drug. You got to gobble up a little bit of arbitrary difference as a collective in order to maintain one's sense of self. And the problem in the old world is that they knew that undifferentiation was a big problem. That if you don't have boundaries about that's my property, that's your property. This is my family, that's your family. This is my food, that's your food, right? This is my identity, that's your identity, right? If you don't have those they're almost artificial, but they're not really, but arbitrary. Let's call them arbitrary differentiation, right? If you don't have that, the ancient communities knew that you're going to have a lot of chaos. You're going to have a lot of violence and a lot of hell on earth, a loss of self that's going to always try to reassert its sense of self by gobbling up somebody else's difference. And so that's cannibalism. That's an existential cannibalism that's at the heart of this problem that humanity has. And so what the ancient communities would do is they would have a strict taboos of difference. So differentiation was mediated by taboos and rituals and rites and hierarchy. And then what would happen is that when someone had a arbitrary marker of differentiation, that could be if they were in a sea of sameness, if you lose that differentiation and you go into an undifferentiated state, anybody who has a marker of differentiation is vulnerable to being scapegoated, to being sacrificed, right? And so that's that mechanism. In the modern world, because of the cross, because of Christianity, it's now they're trying to create the opposite of that, right? Where we're going to normalize undifferentiation to various degrees and sacrifice anyone who maintains differentiation. So it's the inversion of the old order, which was maintain differentiation as normative. And then every now and then you allow a festival or a carnival or a crisis that's not under their control that spills into undifferentiation. And then you select someone who's different, you kill them, you eat them, you banish them, and then you maintain differentiation again, right? With the modern world, it's the inversion. Because nowadays, if you say that a nuclear family, male and female, in a monogamous relationship is the best design, that's an act of differentiation that you're making. And therefore, you must be sacrificed by the collective as an inversion of the old order, right? Because the idea is if you say a male and female husband and wife married with a family for life, if you say that's a standard that we should achieve and that we should value as special, the opposite of that is implied that, well, other types of relationships are not as good, and therefore you're differentiating them, and therefore you're setting them up for the occasion for them to be sacrificed by being marginalized, by being denied, a status that is special, and therefore being vulnerable to being sacrificed or scapegoated in a violent way, such as trans kids being bullied, which is a real thing, right? So the modern mind, because it's so infected by the Christian story, it has this tendency to try to sacrifice any attempt at differentiation, so as to try to sacralize and maintain as normal a state of constant undifferentiation, right? Mm-hmm. Paul says there's no Jew nor Gentile, nor Greek nor slave, no slave, no master, no male nor female. And so this undifferentiation that they've taken and radicalized is something that has to, in an inverted way, feed on the sacrifices, to feed on human sacrifices that want to assert differentiation. So that works itself in every field of controversy in the West. In an engineering department, if it's not 50% women graduating from engineering, that means that there's too much differentiation going on in the mind of the Christ-haunted West. Because, wait a second, if women are not equally interested in engineering, perhaps there's some kind of structural thing that's oppressing them from having access to the power of engineering education. And therefore, they're more vulnerable to being lower on the hierarchy or to be feeling marginalized or oppressed, and therefore they're more likely to be sacrificed. Therefore, we will preemptively sacrifice anything that looks like differentiation, that it's excluding them from equal or what they would call equity in whatever every situation, like in the engineering department. How many people are graduating from engineering departments that are male versus female? So as long as it's 70% male or 60% male, that's a kind of differentiation which is just too intolerable to handle. It needs to be undifferentiated. It needs to be everybody is just a blank slate. Everybody is an amorphous blob of self-creation. And so that's the problem we're at. This is where we're at. This is the heart of almost every single issue in the West. Because and here's the difference. It's because of the gospel slowly infecting and awakening us to the scapegoat mechanism, but we're quicker to recognize the ways in which differentiation can be an occasion for violence. So we see that, and therefore we say differentiation itself is violence. And I would disagree with that, see? I would say some types of differentiation are oppressive and bad, But there are other types of differentiation, like saying a nuclear family is the best model for the flourishing of civilization. That is a kind of differentiation that you should never be shy of. You should never be ashamed of that. Knowing what we know about human beings and what we're made to be. And so here's the way I changed. I'm just kind of laying the table about how I look at this, is that the West, they want to turn differentiation itself into violence and therefore worthy of preemptive violence through shaming, cancel culture, and ultimately law and coercion and violence. Whereas, what the proper Christian thing should be, which is to protect and maintain healthy forms of differentiation, but to be against the use of violence, the initiation of violence, and vengeance to settle problems. It's the opposite with the victimist left. The victimist left is differentiation is prohibited and violence is okay. And I'm saying no, differentiation is okay and violence should be prohibited as much as possible.
Yeah. Ultimately, it seems like what comes true to me is, when Jesus said on the cross, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." So how do you break that wall of even engaging in a conversation or even having a discussion or trying to approach this subject with regards to oppression and the idea that we should not want to have oppression, but we don't want to reciprocate oppression to what we consider the previous oppressors. Like, oppression is bad, violence is bad. But when this understanding and this kind of mob mentality kicks in, something that seemed seemingly so obvious, and would be so obvious, it seems, to the people that are infected with this idea, it's lost on them. And there's almost, what is a way to engage? What is a way to kind of break through that? The way I was reading about the end of the I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, they were talking about, I think it was in John, that when the rooster crowed, it broke the hypnosis. And I see this is like a mass hypnosis. What is the rooster to crow? In the book, it was the Holy Spirit that instantiated the rooster because it was predicted. What is that in our context, in our reality now?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's the voice of the victim. Mm-hmm. So the question is the Holy Spirit as active today as he was when he made that rooster crow in that story, in that poetry? What's the answer for you?
Yes, I think it's gaining in intensity. You see, it's an aside, Kanye West's new video where he has, one of the hooks is Holy Spirit, come down. Holy Spirit, come down. We need you now. Mm-hmm. I think we're seeing that happen. But when you tell somebody that you're treating me as a victim or you're scapegoating me as a white male, there's no register there. It's like
it's because differentiation is taboo, but violence is okay. Do you see what I mean?
But they're differentiated, like the whole intersectional movement. It's more differentiated in terms of, a black, female, trans, it breaks it down into the particular like that. So it seems that what they are against, what they are against outwardly, they're doing inwardly, right? Because they want to different, what I'm saying? It's this kind of double negative or this kind of, contention there that seems interesting.
Well, within a collective, you have these kind of taboos, right, that create this distinction between the members of a collective body, right? But from the outside, they look undifferentiated, right? But internally, they have taboos that maintain what they perceive to be vast differences within their collective tribe, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah.
But from the outside, they look relatively like undifferentiated mass of herd mentality, and that's for any ideology. Mm-hmm. So from an outsider's perspective, libertarianism is like one thing. Mm-hmm. But within libertarianism, there is very, very vast and angry and very, very vicious differences and squabbles and hatreds and rivalries. What binds them together are that there are a few shared taboos that they all come together around. But eventually what these groups do, because of the cross, they can't keep their boundaries intact for long without somebody violating those shared taboos that we are Presbyterians, we are Greek Orthodox, we are Libertarians, we are Marxists, we are whatever it is, and those dogmas. If someone violates some of those taboos, then they're going to be banished as a way of preserving the shared sense of oneness of the community. Mm-hmm. That's based on those identity markers for belonging to that group. You know what I mean? So if you break those, if you break the identity markers, if you break the dogmas that bind up that community, if you break them, then someone has to be expelled for that in order to keep the unity of that collective identity intact. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it seems like in the last couple hundred years maybe, where we all had a collective taboos that we worked under the kind of Christian metaphysics, right? That's been disintegrated, especially in the last 100 years. Is there a way to create or instantiate meta taboos where an identity can form around disparate groups that are clinging on to these taboos that are really that are really not even good for them, that they're ultimately the problem? Are there meta taboos that can be created? Is there an identity that can form out of all of this differentiation?
Yep. Well, the reason why I think the church has lost its ability to step in with authority here is because, for various reasons, the church has tended to side with the throne on a lot of things. The church has tended to use its voice in a very meek and toothless manner, so that if you are on the side of the scapegoat mechanism, how do you expect people to take your message seriously, right? If the church is supposed to be the prophetic witness that exposes the scapegoat mechanism and the lies built around the institutions of culture that are hiding that scapegoat mechanism from us, if the church is just picking a side in the preservation of sacrificial violence, how in the world can anybody expect to get anything out of the house of Jesus? So if the church is not speaking out very effectively against going to war for preemptive reasons, I'm not going to go the full way of going against all war. I'm trying to be moderate here. I'm trying to be, big tent here and be very low bar for achievement. The church has not, and at least in America, has not been consistent in defending victims from the scapegoat mechanism. So why would anybody turn to the church to learn how to fight against the scapegoat mechanism when the left more effectively takes it and wipes the floor with everybody? So the left more effectively imitates the aesthetic of the cross than even the church does in some cases. The church has the metaphysics of the cross, right? But they don't have the aesthetic of the cross, because otherwise, if they truly did, they'd be telling stories for generations now that show the plight of the victim against the collective. And you get it here and there, but the church has largely kind of become silent in its prophetic witness. We're not speaking. If we use the church to say, excuse me, we're not going to send our children off to war for Saudi princes to have their way with our children's bodies to go off and fight for wars. We're not doing that. You know what I mean? We're not doing that. If you're in my church, if I'm the parish priest or whatever your model is, if you're in my church and you're thinking about sending your kid off to war for a Saudi prince to make some money for oil, you're not doing that. You're going to be disciplined here. You're not doing that in this church. No one does that. Who does that? That's just one issue, war. How about policing? Excuse me, if you want to be a police, that's cool. That's good. Fight real crimes. Fight the murderers, the rapists, and all this. But if I hear that you're on a drug task force doing no-knock raids, barging into the house of children of God in the middle of the night, putting your knee on people's necks, tasing people for a vice, that the Bible would not have any evidence that you should use violence to stop the vice of drug use, if you're not preaching that at the pulpit and at the institutional level, at the broader level of the national conversation, then nobody's going to respect you when you say, hey, too much violence. Well, where were you all this time? That's the problem of the church. So it's like, if the church isn't doing its job to defend the victim, because what does the Holy Spirit mean? Holy Spirit means paraclete. Mm-hmm. Where have we been defending the victims of the Iraqis that have been killed in the Iraq War, in Syria, in Libya, in Afghanistan? And what about the children? What about the children of the soldiers who come back from war with PTSD? And there's silenced victims all over this country with PTSD being transferred from one person who has moral harm from what they've seen and what they had to participate in as a soldier. And then that PTSD is transferred generationally to children. Now, this has been happening for a long time. This has been happening for decades under all these godless wars that we've been engaged in. So you've grown up with generations of husbands that come back shell-shocked, and then they transfer that brokenness, that moral harm, that moral brokenness, and the trauma of that to their children, and those children often pass it down to their children. So it's this generational destruction of the peace of the home. Why? Because the church refuses to repent of its worship of Caesar instead of being against and challenging Caesar. You know, we have a luxury in the West that Paul didn't have. You know, when Paul was under Rome, at the time, Caesar didn't say, hey, tell us what you think we should do. He had to deal with the underground church kind of deal. We have a luxury wherein our Caesar, our founders, have created a system in which they said, you need to judge the moral foundation of the law itself. And if we become tyrants, you need to clean us out and use the jury system or use whatever you have to do to take care of it. So our Caesar is very Christian infected with a lot of different mechanisms for self-repair and self-improvement. And so there is no excuse for the church, in my opinion, having that kind of freedom, not living under Soviet Union, not living under communist China, having that kind of free witness and saying, meh, we're going to go ahead and use our pulpit in the moral majority, in the interviews that our pastors do in the public square. We're going to shill for war. We're going to shill for the drug war. We're going to shill for criminalization of every action you can do, raw milk, selling alternative medicine, just total tyranny in the name of having a seat at the king's table so you get a little crumb every now and then. A Supreme Court pick who doesn't do anything for you, like John Roberts. That's what the church sold its soul for. They've been doing this for decades. So there's no wonder why, we're scratching our heads, figuratively thinking, hey, how come nobody wants to listen to the way the church talks about the protection of the human person and forgiveness and mercy? But that time's gone because we've long abandoned the witness of Christ on these, as a collective. Okay.
Yeah, there was a lot there. That was great. I think the church is subject to ideology as well. So when we're sending our men and women, our young men and women to war, it's not in the sense to go get PTSD. It's because there's injustice happening in the Middle East. You could make that so it's not delivered in this way that we see it after the fact. And the church is just susceptible to these ideologies that are infective of all of our social, political, economic kind of consciousness. So after the fact, not only do we see that the war was unjust, we see that the church was ultimately for an unjust war. So where is the teeth of the church to protect against something like this? So when you said that Paul was in the underground church, what is our underground church now? What is the solution, in a sense, from a modern, non-sacrificial Christian understanding of our predicament right now?
Well, I think we're still not an underground. I mean, you're right. We should think it's a tricky thing. I think when you go to a country like Japan, it's helpful for helping you understand your own country. Mm-hmm. Because when you go to Japan, it's clear if you're a Christian with a Western frame of these different values. If you've got a westernized Christian frame and you go to Japan, you can see the hallmarks of Western Christian values infiltrating some of the institutional way of doing things in Japan. But largely speaking, you understand that you're a minority religion in that community. There are other foundational principles at work that are quite much more relevant to the way they do things. And it helps you see with new eyes what's really happening back home, like in America, where the numbers show 80% are Christian, but functionally they're about as Christian as the Japanese Buddhists and atheists and Shintoists or whatever over back in Japan. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's just to make the point in a hyperbolic way, which is that we're not aware of how non-Christian so much of the Christian culture that we think is Christian in America is. And it's pagan. Pagan.
That's used right now. That's used as a way to say, hey, look at you hypocritical Christians that are trying to tell the world about the nuclear family when you have just as much divorce. Like that is used in a kind of double way to continue the disintegration of Christianity. So it's from within and from without.
Right. That's right. You're right. So that's the thing. It's a tricky thing. I don't want to scandalize the church as a scapegoat. But if we're going to be the adults in the room, we have to judge ourselves like adults compared to if the church is supposed to be the trendsetter for leading the nations into baptism, then we have to be graded at a little bit higher standard internally. At the same time, you're right. We have to be very clear that you are not going to challenge the timeless truths of what the church preaches and teaches just because those who have used the language of the church have failed to live up to the standards that we would want them to live up to on a lot of areas. That does not, it's like if Jesus is the professor and a lot of kids who took his class have been flunking around and they fail the class and they don't know much about what he taught. You don't judge the professor necessarily. You say, no, those kids were flunking around. Yeah, they were in that guy's class. And yeah, they got some influence. But you don't condemn the professor's work. You don't condemn the professor's teaching if the student, in his free will, chooses to flunk around and make a fool of himself and fail the class. And so in the same case, you protect and defend the church's truth, but you have to have a spirit of revival. So what does that look like for me? I created a neighbor's choice first as an attempt to try to engage the church. But I found more of a hearing in the secular world immediately available to myself. And so I just adapted and said, okay, well, I'll bring the message of Jesus to the secular space as much as I can. And at the same time, I'll talk to Christians as much as I can too. But ultimately, you got to think about it this way. The Holy Spirit is the defender. He's the defense attorney. Paraclete, defense attorney. Satan, the accuser. So we've got a courtroom drama here. We got the Satan, which is the system of governmental powers and institutions and culture, and their crony corporations and so on, and all the myths that they have, accusing. And then you have this underdog movement, the Holy Spirit, which is the defender of the victims being accused. And so we in the church have to tell the victim story. This is what I call the gospel technology, which is that in the Gospels, you have a piece of media technology, which is a transcription. First, it's, I guess, oral tradition, and then it becomes written down. I don't really know what the story was, but the Gospels are a form of media technology in which they tell the truthful story of a wrongful persecution of an innocent man for a nonviolent crime, and they use the media that they have available for them in that epoch of history to do so. And so my simple message, this is all I figured out basically, in terms of what the church can do, is to tell victim stories today. And use the media that you have available, whether it's a podcast or a radio or a Facebook or an Instagram or a TV show or a church pulpit or whatever it is. Use your platform to use your voice in the spirit of the Paraclete to defend victims. So what in the world are we talking about being a part of Holy Spirit community if we're not being defense attorneys for victims? And if we do that, and all you got to do is tell their story. So I'll give you an example. Craig Cecil was a guy that I've had call into the show many times in my program. He was in prison for life for doing body work on trucks that were moving marijuana. He didn't handle the marijuana. But he went to trial. All the people who handled it, they took a plea. They got out in a few years. He got a life sentence because he went to trial. So this man spent, I think, 17 years of his life in federal prison, and he watched terrorists and murderers come and go, and he was still there. Never did marijuana. He was doing body work on the trucks that were moving it. So recently, we would just let him tell his story. And his story is a powerful one in and of itself because that's gospel technology. You present a media. The gospel writers, they wrote down, Jesus did this. This is what they said. This is what Herod did. This is what Pilate did. So if I use a radio show or whatever it is, okay, Craig is this. Craig does this. Caesar does this. This is what, you just let it speak. And the narrative itself has a way of allowing you to dismantle the scapegoat mechanism behind the situation that the victim finds themselves in. And that's it. That it almost seems too simple to be the solution, right? Because you're like, well, there's got to be something else. We got to do a formula. We got to do something. But it's like I believe there's a Holy Spirit gospel power in using media technology to tell the truthful story. So from the gospel's perspectives, they are telling a counter narrative to the establishment narrative. If you read the establishment narrative about Craig Cecil, it would not look like the voice that I gave him on my radio show. Do you know what I mean? Like if you were to read what the prosecutor's office said about their conviction of Craig Cecil, they would have painted him in the worst light. He's a monster. He's a heretic. He's a blasphemer. He's a wine bibber. He's a glutton, right? You see what I mean? I'm using those languages specifically to parallel it to the way they would have talked about Jesus when they killed him. So the gospel technology is when you take a counter narrative and you say, no, we'll look at it from this angle. Craig Cecil is a father. Craig Cecil's daughter wants to get, married and wants him to walk her down the aisle. Why is he being treated as a violent person in a prison sentence for life for a nonviolent crime? You're bearing false witness against your neighbor. You put people in a cage who are violent. You put people in time, if you're going to use a cage, okay? If you're going to put a timeout, if you're going to have a prison, it should be a place for people who are violent. So we're sinning as a nation when we're supposed to be 70% Christian. 70% of juries should be saying no, not guilty to people like Craig Cecil. We should be using our Christian witness to dismantle structures of violence. And if we would do that, here's my theory. If we would do that, the critical theory crap and the woke stuff would evaporate like this. I believe that without a shadow of a doubt, that the power of the gospel is so beautiful and so glorious and gorgeous when we do it right, that these cheap imitations like critical theory that are trying to imitate the aesthetic of the gospel, but to reinsert the sacrificial violence of the satanic scapegoat mechanism, if we would just show the victim and stop the persecution and truly be the Holy Spirit community, I think it would be so beautiful, people would gladly flock towards the church. So that's my idea for that. That's a lot.
What do you mean by the church?
By the church?
Yeah.
Well, believing in the traditional beliefs of the church. I don't have any preference for where they're going to go. I just want them to stop killing their neighbors,
Gotcha. Yeah, that's
Nicene Creed, whatever you want to use as your. At some point when I talk about the church, I talk about imitating Jesus.
Okay.
So I'm trying to be broad about this, because if I pick a camp and say I want them to be Catholics or Orthodox or Protestants, then that's a whole nother rabbit trail. And the first step I want to do as a Christian is to get people to love their neighbor as their self. So if we've got millions of people converting to Protestantism, but they're still sending people off to war to die for lies, then they're not loving their neighbors as their self. You mentioned that they're tricked by ideology. Ideology is a modern vestige of myth, right?
What would the retort be that you are just presenting an ideology that, you are looking through a lens as well. And from the history of the oppression of certain groups, we're in a situation now when we talk about telling the victim story. This is a good, I think, example of what you're talking about, of the mimetic scapegoating that's inserted of George Floyd, right? He is a victim. His story is being told on the biggest stage that's out there, right? And this, I think, speaks to the problem and the solution is this media complex, that controls all of the information, how it's presented, how it's talked about, how long it's talked about, what the reactions can be. It's a tightly controlled network of media platforms, even the decentralized ones now, which are being, censored. The retort will be, well, you're just trying to provide your ideology, and it's no better or worse than mine, especially because I've been to the university and I've had 6 years of, I got a master's in, women's studies or whatever it may be. How can you tell me you're just throwing your ideology, and the key point I think that you driven home was, love your neighbor as yourself. Like, who's your neighbor? How do you consider everyone your neighbor? How do you expand the sphere of who you consider your neighbor? And how do you incorporate the idea to love God with all your heart when the idea of God has been, in almost every sense except like a California Buddhist type sense, has been shown to be that God is dead, the death of God. So if you can't love God with all your heart, how can you love your neighbor as yourself? And how do you bridge that gap? I'm kind of thinking out loud there. There's seen a lot of, I wanted to kind of get your take on, I know you had a talk with Jordan Hall, and he is working with John Vervaeke on this idea of the religion that's not a religion. And they had this, one of his deep code excerpts he just released talked about faith and how we should, with the increased uncertainty causes anxiety. How do you not channel that anxiety into fear? And they were talking about this analogy of being in an ocean or being on a sailing boat that's being swamped, right? And there's this idea of gaining yourself through faith where you're not swamped and you find that place where you're sailing again, which to me reminded me of Matthew, of the story of Jesus in the water. It's like there's a structure there that is fundamental. And no matter what kind of cognitive idea you're trying to produce, it seems like it's an attractor that comes back to the same structure of the story. If you have to have faith, they're trying to reinterpret it. So I don't know if there's something there that it can help with the idea of the death of the church, the death of Christianity, in the same sense that Christ had to die to be resurrected.
Right.
There's this idea that Christianity had to die in order to be resurrected. And so what is that going to look like? And I've been trying to think of what is Christ crucified. We know what Christ crucified is. What does Christianity crucified look like? And the thought came to me as that's the apocalypse. The apocalypse is Christianity itself is crucified in some sense. So what is the solution to that? When there are a lot of people, like you said, a lot of secular people are interested in your work. A lot of secular people are coming back to these ideas. So in one sense, I think that's the Holy Spirit working. In another sense, it seems so insurmountable when you look at the forces, the government, the media, the industry that will not allow this message to be amplified. When you can't turn around and accuse the government, I like to do it all the time, you accuse the media, you become the accuser. It's very easy to become the accuser. You see on social media, people just losing friends left and right, lifelong friends and family members, because one says you should wear a mask and the other shouldn't. And instead of agreeing to disagree, they lose touch completely. So it's like things are getting worse in this ramping up to the inability to communicate with each other. So it's like there's problems at multiple levels. I come back to trying to do the best that I can locally with my family, with my neighbors, with my friends, and having conversations like this. Once you start thinking about it too much, especially if you're into complexity theory and whatnot, you're like, oh man, it's either hopeless or not even worth thinking about. So I try to bring it back to.
Yeah. Well, I'm a little more optimistic than Girard was at the end of his last book, The Battling to the End. I believe that, when Jesus says he's going to save the world, he's going to save the world. And that's going to happen in his life. I believe that's going to happen in history. And when in Habakkuk 2 says that, which he quotes on the road to Jerusalem, as he walks in with Hosanna, on the donkey, Habakkuk 2 says that the knowledge of the Lord will fill the earth as the ocean is wet. And I think that's happening. And I think we're becoming more Christian than we've ever become in history. At the same time, it's an escalation. It's a détente between the forces of accusation and the forces of defense. But one of the things that we're missing within just that is something that's an older part of what we're all supposed to be doing as Christians, which is the dominion mandate in Genesis to subdue the earth. And so the Bible, begins in a garden, it ends in a city, right? And there's a cultivation charge that we're supposed to be doing. And, Peter Thiel points this out a lot, all over, because he's taking Rene Girard and he's applying it as an interpreter of geopolitics and business and economics. And he's saying there hasn't been innovation much in the world of atoms since the 70s, right? That's what his little famous line is. And there's a lot of reasons for that. He says, one of them is that we've had over-regulation in the world of atoms and relatively less regulation in the world of bits. Mm-hmm. So capital flows towards things that can be done without regulatory hurdles. And that goes into the world of bits. And that's a good explanation. I think that explains some of it. And then some of it, he says, is maybe not government. Maybe it's just a lack of courage in our culture to think outside the box and to challenge established dogmas. And I think the other way of looking at that is that it kind of in keeping with that thought, in the 1970s, you have the end of the Bretton Woods system. The final connection to gold is severed. And I was talking to Ron Paul about that yesterday, and he was saying that's what got him into Congress, right? That's what got him to run for Congress, was he realized, holy crap, we're about to go into an unprecedented state of insanity here, where we're going to create money out of thin air and have no backing for our money, and the whole world's going to be buying into this reserve currencies. And sure enough, since that happened, that's when the stagnation in wages seemed to really take off. Because once you're able to monetize the debt, you're again violating a principle of the protection of the victim, because the Bible talks about unjust weights and measures. And if you can create credit out of thin air, that's not a just weight and measure. It destroys the purchasing power of the middle class and those on fixed incomes the most, because it takes newly created credit and gives it to Wall Street and government bureaucracies. And then before that money circulates throughout the rest of the economy, by the time it circulates, it causes prices to increase in the different areas in which the credit is flowing towards: healthcare, college, and housing and so forth, mortgage. So what happens is it's a redistribution of wealth from the poor and middle class to the rich and the elite and the bureaucracies and the cronies of Wall Street. So here's what I'm saying. If you abandon the principle of free will and nonviolence, it's going to create chaos. And the church, again, has not spoken a thing about the morality of having a Federal Reserve System that debases the currency and monetizes debt so that a government can create money out of thin air to do everything, to create a prison industrial complex where it costs each person $50,000 a year to house, and to create all these perpetual government programs and regulations and things that stifle the economy. But ultimately, I think that one of the things that we have to do in the church is to remember that our vocation is not just to fight about morality issues and even the war and stuff that I'm talking about, but it's to make stuff. Our job is to make stuff. That doesn't mean that I'm not saying that the church, like your local church, has to be building a company, but we, in the vocation of being in the image of Christ, we need to make things. And so therefore, I think that when Peter Thiel talks about we have to figure out how to get past stagnation, he says that because if you have a stagnant pie and it's not growing, then it's going to create the occasions for scapegoat violence. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is if you're not growing in the world of atoms in terms of innovation, then there's no real wealth accumulation that's expanding. Therefore, it's a static universe. Therefore, all the different interest groups and tribal identities are going to flare up in that context, and they're going to start stabbing and grabbing and attacking and accusing and blaming and tearing each other down. so that they can get some of the pieces of the pie cut bigger for them, because no one believes that the pie can actually get bigger anymore, right? Mm-hmm. So if you don't believe the pie can get bigger, you're going to try to take and stab and tear down other people, and you're going to use politics as your primary weapon of identity. That's why our society is becoming totally politicized.
Yeah,
because to be politicized is to be totally saturated in scapegoat blaming. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that the church is supposed to do to alleviate this is to be the Galileo, to be the Teslas of the world, to be the Newtons, to be the Bacons, to be whoever, whatever it is you want to appeal to.
The Wests.
What's that? Kanye West. Yeah, he's trying to do that. So he's trying to do that, but to actually do it yourself. So you're saying, how do we get out of here? Well, here's what it takes. It takes good role models. So I believe you say that religion, that church is dead. I don't believe that. I know you don't mean that in that way, but let me ask you something. Why do you think that people don't believe in the metaphysics of Christianity?
Because of the fallibility of human beings that's transferred onto the God they're trying to emulate. You see that, look at the glaring situation of the 90s, the big conspiracy theory in the early 90s that there is this molestation that's happening globally with priests. It seems like such a ridiculous thing that ended up becoming true, right? And then you look at the evangelicals in the maybe 80s and 90s, you see the kind of moralizing that was done, and the obvious duplicitous from an outsider's perspective. This person saying he's Christian, he's against abortion and contraception and all this whatnot, but he's going to have sex in the bathroom down by the highway, and all of this stuff that's been played out in the media. It's a narrative that has been put into place, and I think the people that are developing this narrative, I think they are in cahoots, not in some kind of conspiratorial way, with this idea of the wealth that's been created since World War II, since the baby boomer generation innovated and created and sucked all this capital up into the hands of a few, and they continue to hold it in their hands. So as generations like the millennials, they feel this anxiety. They feel a loss of agency. They don't feel any kind of any future in terms of, they don't own real estate. They don't feel that they have anything to hope for in the future. Now with all these pandemics and the 2008 crash, before that was 9/11. So you're seeing all of these disasters. You're seeing no ability to accumulate any wealth or resources. The same people that are responsible for this, the government, the media, these corporations that exhibiting this rent-seeking behavior, that they're just trying to move the pieces of the pie in different ways to the highest level that they are, but then they are making the situation between the people inflammatory through racism. And they know that if they start looking at the right direction, not necessarily in the accusatory way of why they're not able to flourish, they're trying to pin us against our neighbors. People are arming themselves to the tilt across this country. Well, the media is amplifying racial division that's artificial. There is racial division. I mean, you have to give a caveat, but it's a lot less than it's ever been. And you're amplifying the worst stuff that's happened, like the George Floyd situation. It was horrible, a tragedy. I don't know anybody that would say that that was okay or even be indifferent to it, which wasn't the case 30 to 40 years ago, or even more. We've gone a long way. Why are we being channeled to continue to fight neighbor against neighbor over masks, over opening and closing schools, these racial divides, and you can't even speak to each other, So it's like the powers that be, and not, and again, in some conspiratorial sense, understand this mechanism of the scapegoating mechanism, and they're playing that for the population to continue to fight amongst each other, so they can hold on to their little bit of resources, for that much longer, the 20 years of life they have left.
It's true. They're rent seekers, but that sounds, what you described sounds like much of the pagan world, the ancient world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's why they had a cyclical view of history, I mean, there was innovation, but what's interesting is that because they were so enclosed in the satanic accusatory frame of doing things, most of the innovation in the ancient world, from what I've looked at, happens in the archaic and ancient world through mastery of war, how to kill people better. Mm-hmm. So there's not a lot of the nonviolent innovation that you get really ramping up fast until you get to the Christian infection world. As Girard says, you know, we didn't stop burning witches because we discovered the scientific method. We discovered the scientific method because we stopped burning witches. And what caused us to pause for the millionth time when we're about to burn a witch and say, I don't think Martha did it. I don't think that's the way we're going to solve our stress. Look at that weird thing growing on that man's nose and that corpse. Let's see if we can take a bigger look at that. So they'd say, how do we make a magnifying, you know what I mean? Let's take a piece of glass. Can you see it closer? What is that? Now, what was that? Can we figure out? And then you get medicine. Okay. And that's a Christian moment, that what happens is, if we do what we're supposed to do, which is tell the victim's story, what happens is it starts to slow down the appetite of the community to keep on scapegoating. And as it starts to slow down, now there's a possibility to shift the perspective of the community away from the zero-sum model of the sacrificial world, where we have to put someone's skin in the game, take somebody else's skin in the game, in order to keep the gods and to keep community going. And then we get to stop because we're recognizing, wait a second, we can't lock up people for life for drugs. We can't be throwing prostitutes in prison for years. Maybe this is not the best way to treat people. Maybe we shouldn't put Amish farmers who sell raw milk in a prison with rapists and murderers. So all these things are happening simultaneously in various levels of various energy, most momentum, and these things are percolating, and we're starting to have a slow process of repentance. Mm-hmm. Now, we can do it the easy way or the hard way. What I'm telling you is, don't worry. It's scary in the short term, but in the big picture, all of these things that you see about happening in the headlines are a testament to the authority and the sovereignty of Jesus in history. That Jesus is the master of history, because he predicted every one of these things that's happening. He said, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. That's happening in history. A man who was in the middle of a small backwoods town called Galilee came into history, and he said, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first, when my movement of the kingdom of heaven is unleashed into the earth. He said that mothers would be against daughters. Isn't that what's happening right now with the protests? Mm-hmm. Everything he said is coming to true. So take heart in knowing that the master of history is truly in control. Now, the paradox is, don't be complacent, because we have a radical freedom to make this easier or harder on all of us by what we do. If we slink away from being good role models, then the culture will not be able to mimetically imitate a more effective representation of Christ, right? Yeah, so if there are no, what's that saying? If good men do nothing, evil will flourish, or whatever, Edmund Burke. Mm-hmm. That's a Christian thing if you think about it. I mean, obviously, right? It's like if we don't have positive role models, if all we have to choose from is Donald Trump and Joe Biden and whoever, that's our best. Mm-hmm. Where's the C.S. Lewis's? We should have 20 C.S. Lewis's and 20 G.K. Chestertons and Augustine or whoever you like, whoever, Cyprian. Where's Cyprian when you need him? Cyprian, 250 A.D. says the whole world is wet with murder, and what is considered to be a crime if it's done on the individual scale is considered to be okay if it's done on the collective scale. That sounds like Frederick Bastiat, but it's not. It's 250 A.D., a Christian bishop of the church in Africa. So we don't need to be stuck on the Enlightenment to get our ideas. Our stuff is in the church. We just need to bring the past back into the future and build on what the fathers did before. And so what I'm saying is, when I look at the situation that we're in, we have to innovate. That's the number one thing. And here's why Christians are uniquely tasked with being able to innovate. Because if we see through the lie of the scapegoat mechanism, we should be a little bit more skeptical about things that are considered to be settled. Think about that. Think about that for a moment. remember what you were talking to me. You were saying that we're not getting anywhere. We're blaming each other. Nothing's getting grilled. It feels like a pressure cooker. That's the sacred. Although it's worse because now we're awakening up to the sacred 2,000 years after Jesus, but because we're not innovating, which is the vocation of the church, we're supposed to cultivate and defend victims. It's not like we just defend victims and act like a bunch of do-nothings, just standing in the way of crowds trying to kill people. That's a good part. We should do that. We're not doing that enough. But at the same time, besides just being peacemakers, we should be peace builders by creating technologies that alleviate the effects of scarcity on people's minds and hearts. And I talked about that with Jordan Hall, right? With the fishes and loaves, the way I interpret that is that's almost a prophetic statement about what our vocation will look like in history, that you take someone voluntarily offers his fishes and loaves and you don't chop them up so that each person gets a tiny sliver of fish, but rather Jesus just takes the fish and in some kind of miracle, the material scarcity is overcome through love, through self-service. So the way I interpret that is we have to overcome the bounds of scarcity in the market. You see what I mean? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, you broke up a little bit.
I said we need to maintain that we have to transcend the bounds of scarcity through let's see. Are we having an issue here?
You're good now. You broke up for a bit.
So what I was saying was we have to be able to maintain, or not maintain, we have to be able to transcend the confines of scarcity using nonviolent innovations in what we call the market. The market in this case doesn't mean you have to make an obscene profit. It means you have to create something without stealing from somebody else to do it. That's what the state is. So what does that? So that's what I'm saying is that you mentioned that our wealth was generated around the time of the baby boomers. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, well, a tremendous amount of innovation and wealth was created after World War II and during World War II, obviously because of the war, and that has been stifled, since the neoliberal policies that were put into place in the 70s and whatnot. And it seems to have continued, and they've bled into the future generations where it's caused a lot of the possibility for the issues that we're having here. I have a quick question though. You talked about the fish and the loaves story. We are consumers. We're in a capitalist consumerist nation. We watch television, which has commercials, which plays on this mimetic desire for us to want the shoe that the basketball player is selling. My kids now watch YouTube Kids, and there's these cutest little kids in a family, cute as can be. They have 1 million subscribers, and they're just selling toys the whole time by just watching them play with toys and whatnot, right? So we need to fundamentally change that situation of mimetic desire and short circuit it, where I don't know how to amplify that. And this is where I always get stuck. Do it at the specific level, at the personal level. But we're consumers. We're capitalists. My question is, can you separate the free market, the market, from capitalism?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, people hate that word capitalism so much. So I'll defend it because I think that's free markets. But if people don't think that's free markets, then they can. What I tell people is like, if you think what we have today in America is capitalism, and that's what you hate, then I hate the status quo too. If that's what you call capitalism, that's fine, but it's not a free market. Mm-hmm. So I don't really, people. This is the problem with communication is that there's so much, emotional violence and stuff built into these words that people have such a visceral reaction to, and we'll argue past each other for years because we don't like the word. So yeah. I think capitalism is a free market, and therefore what we have is not a free market. Therefore, it's not capitalism. It's crony corporatism. It's state managed. 1/2 of every economic transaction in America is $1, and that's centrally planned by the Federal Reserve System, which is a plank of the Communist Manifesto. How are we in capitalism? This is not capitalism. This is
the exact opposite. Has been taught to a generation and a half in the universities, in mass, and these folks have graduated and are in media and are in government and are in business and are in the tech sector. And they really believe that what we have is a capitalist system, and that needs to be dismantled in a sense, when you're exactly right. I mean, it's far from a free market capitalist system, but that's what's used as a scapegoat, essentially. It's this Yuri Bezmenov. He was a Soviet defector from the KGB. I don't know if you've seen some of his videos. He was talking about this in the 70s, the late 70s. He predicted every single thing that's happening in our country right now. He predicted it, and he brings it back, and it seems conspiratorial of this kind of communist understanding and idea that capitalism needs to be overthrown eventually, and socialism will be what the result is, and then socialism will eventually lead to communism. When you're talking about the story of the fish and the loaves, and you're telling this to an 18-year-old, 19-year-old kid that's in school, and they hear the idea that you can redistribute all the wealth, so sick people and poor people will all have enough that they all need. And, rich people, the ones that have all the money, they're going to have enough what they need, but they're not going to have more than everybody else. It sounds so great on paper, and it plays on the heartstrings of compassionate people, right? So that's what draws this idea to socialism and even communism, in a sense, right? We do communion. We take communion in church. Why can we have communism? And it was a disaster in the 20th century. And the reason why it was a disaster, I think, is because you take Christ out of Christianity. If you don't have Christ at the center of the community to solidify the identity, you're going to have disaster. And maybe a different word. I mean, Christ is the answer, but that word has so much baggage, that it's almost impossible to get through the conditioning of most people.
Capitalism?
Almost in that sense. No, Christ. Idea, Christ is the answer. But most people that hear that will have an automatic ridicule in their brain, in their mind.
It's okay, but it's okay. When we create cold fusion and transmutation, they're not going to have that thought about Christ. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
You just got to walk right through it with full confidence. We'll just blaze right through it. If Christian leaders who profess Christ and are conservative people, that meaning they don't want to destroy and have nihilism, if conservative believers who are Christians and defend traditional things, if we're the ones that change the foundation of what's possible with energy too cheap to meter, in transmutation of elements, and transportation revolutions that we can't even imagine right now, if we do that, no one's going to talk crap about the word Jesus if the people who use the word Jesus do those things. That's the way it works. I call it the Mowgli effect, the Jungle Book effect. It's kind of like that. Jungle Book, all the jungle, they bow in reverence to the one who masters the fire. And we have to master the fire that's available in nature for creating the kind of technological revolutions that we think are not possible. And why do we think they're not possible? Because we don't think like Christ. If we think like Christ, we'll have suspicion about untouchable dogmas like the standard nuclear model. That's a mythically enclosed thing that we need to be suspicious of. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Because not only does mimetic theory help you see that you need to be epistemologically skeptical of traditional structures of sacrifice like the state and incarceration and wars, but it also, if you properly apply it, should give you some suspicion about the epistemological foundations of bodies of knowledge like medicine and nuclear physics. I'm just taking two because those are two areas where we could really do a lot of good for if we could figure those things out. Mm-hmm. So do you see what I mean? Like we, I have a theory about one of the reasons why we stagnated and petered off right after after World War II. What ends World War II? In the symbolic way, in the symbolic narrative of World War II.
With the death of Hitler or the Japanese bomb?
Yeah, the atomic bomb.
Atomic bomb. Yeah.
So you got the splitting of the atom, and that's the mastery of the fire. That's the Mowgli moment.
But it's also the violence that presupposes and protects from violence. It's the ultimate destroyer of humanity that is set up to keep humanity from destroying itself. So it kind of has this,
That's later, right? But at the the very ending of World War II, it's this holy smokes. Talk about a Mowgli effect. The whole jungle of the Earth trembles at the thought that somebody could split the atom and blow up a whole city. That's like a oh my goodness moment. That creates a sacred awe around what body of knowledge gave you the atom bomb. It's called physics. Mm-hmm. And ever since that moment, and not just at that moment, but it was fully entrenched at that moment as the holy of holies of scientific establishment thought. And so what I'm saying is that because it has that world-destroying power, who are these priests and their arcane knowledge that can create a world-destroying power? That creates a psychological effect the world over for a reverence to the field of theoretical physics and nuclear physics and all the downstream things from that has still been enclosed in a rarefied atmosphere that people are not allowed to touch, especially people outside of the confines of the narrow academic establishment. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that if we're mimetic theorists, we can be more skeptical of that and say, okay, there could be some truth there, but maybe they don't have the atom fully figured out. Maybe they had experimental data. They had data that was they had, what's the word I'm looking for?
Measuring tools, instruments.
Yeah, they had experimental data. They did not have. So if you have a model of the atom and then you split the atom, the mind of the human is going to say, well, that model is sacred. Don't touch it. It may not be the case that model actually empirical. That's what I was going to get. So if you have this empirical working out of experiments, then you have an established reigning paradigm of what the atom actually is. Then whatever splits the atom and can destroy the whole world, at that moment, you're going to enshrine sacred aura around that model of the atom that was around at the time of that event happening. And what I'm suggesting is, and I'm giving a very broad stroke. I know that this is a lot more complicated, but I'm trying to give you a picture here for where I see things going, which is there's everything about human culture is religiously intertwined with mimetic awe and mimetic faith, right? And so these priests that can be associated with the physics establishment, it becomes harder for us to challenge some of the foundational assumptions built into their model of the atom and how the natural world works, because they had empirically stumbled onto an ability to split the atom. Therefore, we said everything they had done up to that point, we're going to hold in a rarefied air and not allow challenges to that, like a Galileo would do. So that's why in 1989, when Martin Fleischmann and Stanley Pons announced that they had created cold fusion, the physics establishment, which outranks the chemist establishment, or on the pecking order of science, physics outranks chemistry, typically, in terms of prestige. And so when they said they were the world's best chemical engineers, and when they said they announced cold fusion at room temperature, okay, the world went crazy. And then obviously they had made some mistakes. They weren't able to repeat it in an effective way. But what happened was they got scapegoated out of town. I mean, Stanley Pons fled to France and renounced his U.S. citizenship and has remained in silence since. Now, you tell me that's a scientific process. That's not scientific. That's a religion. I don't care. You can get some smarmy little scientific journalist right now from a Nature magazine or whoever and want to mock me for saying this, but they cannot escape that is a brute, primitive way of treating human beings if you disagree with their data, why do you create a situation in which they're so shamed and terrified that they have to renounce their citizenship and flee the country? And we are told that science is purely rational? Come on, Do you see what I mean here?
Yeah, absolutely. What came to mind is Eric Weinstein's idea of the gated institutional narrative.
Yeah.
The citadel of, especially in physics and theoretical physics has done nothing in the last 20 years. They've hung their hat on string theory, which has produced nothing. Their theories don't produce testable experiments that innovate or give us anything. Now, the last thing was the Large Hadron Collider that found the God particle, the Higgs particle, which the implication of which hasn't bore out, right? So Eric Weinstein seems to be challenging the Pharisees, you know, the theoretical physics of this time that are comfortable in their institutions. And he has this idea of the DISC, the distributed idea suppression complex. And I love how he puts these words onto these ideas and these complexes that are, I think, elucidating exactly what you're talking about. And you're seeing that we've come to the end of the theoretical physics as we've known it, with quantum mechanics, the inability to grok it with gravity, with Einsteinian gravity, and its inability to innovate now. We're seeing the dissolution of this institution, of this large institution we know as physics. But we're seeing that happen almost at every level, at every institution, whether it be the WHO or these medical institutions that are absolutely fumbling the coronavirus situation, the FDA, even the FBI and the CIA. We're losing trust in these religious institutions. So we're seeing the kind of a change a change to the future. We're in this liminal space between it. So that's why it's confusing. That's why it's it is what it is. But I'm with you. I think we have to stay the course and kind of put one foot in front of the other. Be that model. Girard said mimetic desire is not inherently bad. It is inherently good, but it's been usurped. If you follow Jesus, don't believe, just believe in Jesus. If you follow what he did in his teachings, and if you follow the 10 commandments, if you actually do them in your life, if you don't do them, you're not going to get punished by some daddy God. If you follow them with an authentic heart, your life will be such that it will flourish and it will turn out, you will have well-being and you will infect well-being to those around you if you follow these with an open heart and in a genuine heart. So there's a lot to kind of unpack with that, with regards to sin and what sin really is, the Greek understanding of amartia, which comes from archery, which means to miss the mark. Right. So if you're sinning, if you're lusting, if you're wanting, the 10th commandment, if you're coveting your neighbor's stuff, your life, you will have mental disease. You will have issues in your life. You will have problems with the relationships in your families and with your neighbors. That's what it means to not covet your neighbor's things. It doesn't mean that you're going to get punished in the afterlife. It means your life now you'll be missing the mark in terms of what you're aiming at. But if you can overcome that, if you focus on that through Christ, right, you will go back on your path and you will be as such as that your life will turn out and will situate itself in a positive well-being state. You see, heroin addicts that have this experience that hit rock bottom, that is metanoia. That is the turning back, the repentance to get back towards, to aiming appropriately. So I think there's a lot to be hopeful for, and I think focusing on that and not being complacent, like you said, is a good way to kind of go about it. If you don't mind, I'd like to read just a passage from the end of Girard here, and maybe you could speak a little to what he's getting at.
Mm-hmm.
All right. It's at the end of Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. And here he was replying to his interlocutor. It's the last couple of paragraphs. So he says, Girard says, what is important above all is to realize that there are no recipes. There is no pharmacon anymore, not even a Marxist or psychoanalytic one. Recipes are not what we need, nor do we need to be reassured our need is to escape from meaninglessness. And here's the sentence here. However large a part of sound and fury signifying nothing there may be in public and private suffering, in the anguish of mental patients, in the deprivations of the poor, and in the rivalries of politics, these things are not lacking in significance, if only because at each moment they are open to the ironic reversal of the judgment against the judge that recalls the implacable functioning of the gospel law in our world. We must learn to love this justice, which we both carry out and fall victim to. The peace that passes human understanding can only arise on the other side of this passion for justice and judgment, which still possesses us, but which we are less and less likely to confuse with the totality of being. And he goes on. But that was a lot to unpack. And it seems like the way forward is the way through. You know, these usurped ideas of social justice. Social justice is a noble cause. But what's happened with the perversion and the scapegoating mechanism that's taken over, you know, the idea is still there. The right idea is still there. The kernel's still there. So I think what he's saying with the ironic reversal is to kind of go through the process. You know, I don't know, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's just the idea that you have to be the role model that you want in the world, and be you know, humble, that at the same time confident in the belief that you can have meaning in your life. And that, you know, when you were talking about all these kids that are our age who feel like they're looking at their parents' generation and they're like, oh, I don't know, there's nothing for me. And it's like, well, who told you that the atom was settled? You know what I mean? Like, who told you that? You got, that we pride ourselves in being such a skeptical generation, but yet we are so religiously faithful to accept the dogmas that have been handed to us. Who told you that these things were settled? Who told you that the war on cancer would always be a failure since the 60s? Who told you that it was a genetic theory of cancer, which is the foundation? What if it's a metabolic foundation? What if it's a mitochondrial approach to medicine that can solve cancer? And what if folks are doing it right now in the hinterlands where the scapegoats always lie? Mm-hmm. You know, the Galileos, the Teslas, I know them. I know these people solving cancer with the metabolic theory. People like Dr. Michael Lasanti in London, in Salford University, people like our friend over in Boston University who's doing things with ketogenic therapy for killing stage 4 cancers. So the problem with millennials are they're too much like their parents. They're too self-absorbed. They need to get out of their self-absorption, their obsession with themselves, and realize that there's a lot of meaning to be found all over this world. You know, I'm over here trying to find these things out myself. I'm on a quest to find out how to do transmutation. I'm on a quest to figure out how to do low temperature nuclear energy. I don't have any qualifications in those fields in a formal sense, but because I don't have those formal trainings, it allows me to have much more of a healthier Christian skepticism of the mimetic dogmas that are surrounding those fields of knowledge. See, Thomas Kuhn is helpful here with Rene Girard, because Thomas Kuhn talks about paradigm shifts, and that paradigms of knowledge and science are held up because of faith. Mm-hmm. So we have this faith, these millennials that say, oh, everything's so bad. Yeah, but you hold on faith that your cancer stuff will be handled by some expert. Why don't you think for yourself? That's courage. That takes courage to do that. And to do that publicly, that takes a lot of courage. Because, see, people are so mimetically sheep-like that they're afraid to look different because they're afraid they'll be scapegoated, as we talked about before. So they're afraid to get outside the box, and they're afraid to be like Tesla and be treated like a freak. Tesla was running circles around a lot of his contemporaries, right? And he didn't wait for people to tell him what he was allowed to think. He went and did it, man. That's what Christians are supposed to do. And if we do that, then people will be attracted to imitate us. The only reason why it's considered to be fashionable to be an agnostic is because all the role models who are supposed to be the smartest people in the room of the last century were agnostic or atheist or whatever. Yeah. So that's the only reason why kids grow up today like, oh, I'm super smart, or I want to be super smart. So they look at who the culture holds up as super smart, and they're like, well, what do they believe about the big things like God? Oh, they don't believe in God? I don't believe in God. See, smart people don't believe in God. No, you don't believe in God because you're imitating someone who you think has the social status that you want. You don't believe in God because of facts. You believe in God because you covet the social status of the Einsteins or whoever in the world that you want to be like, or that you want to be perceived like in your social circle. That's why you don't believe in God. You don't know why you don't believe in God. That's okay. Because you're not supposed to know, really. You're just supposed to imitate, because that's what humans are designed to do. So we, who believe in God, have to step up to the plate, go out into the public square, and with our tools, with our mind, whatever talent you have, make movies better than Werner Herzog and David Lynch and be a Christian. They're very Christian in a lot of their movies, and they're not, I don't even know if they're religious or not. But make movies that bear witness to the mystery of creation. But make movies that deal with the paradox of the human experience and relationships. Make plays like Shakespeare, right? Make rap better than Kanye West, Make fusion that's too cheap to meter. And then watch as those little sniveling little woke green brats try to tell you that their crap solar panels and wind farms are better than unlimited cold fusion. They got nothing. They have nothing, man. These people are gnats. They're just the giant of the church has to wake up and get its guts together, get its mojo back. That's what this is all about, man. So I'm excited. I think it's great.
All we got to do is reconfigure the incentive structures at each level. I had an experience of I came up. My folks were immigrants from Greece. I wanted to have money, and I wanted to buy a house, and I wanted to buy a BMW. As a kid, it was the coolest car and all that. And I ended up getting to that place. I bought a house and I bought a BMW, and I had a mental breakdown in a sense. I had and it was a blessing, right? And that it kind of ended this desire for things. Like I used to go into Best Buy every other day and just look around and get high off looking and buying stuff. And that just went away one day, totally. I'm very grateful for that. But I had a situation, and this might be for another time, where I had an awakening of sorts that I really got into, and I'm still into this, the way that the body heals itself. Like, we can help each other, but there are ways and there's things you can do with your metabolism and working with food, diet, meditation, movements, that can heal your body from the diseases that you would never, ever think. There's a lot there to be said, and there's a lot there to discuss. But I had a healing situation that was, you could call it almost miraculous. It wasn't a severe situation, but it was something that changed and helped me mentally dramatically. And it's information that is out there, but it's gated and it's ridiculed. So I'm with you. We'll keep pushing forward and keep getting that information out there, no matter how silly you look, because how it affects your life, and people will see it and feel it, and then they can take it or leave it.
And the difference you asked about, why is this not an ideology? The difference between an ideology and what we're talking about with Christianity, or let's just call it imitating Jesus. Okay? Mm-hmm. That's the way I talk about it. Everyone should imitate Jesus, whether you're a Christian or not. Whether you understand the Trinity or you're concerned about Balaam's donkey talking, you're worried about that triggers you. If that triggers you, don't worry. It's okay. Just imitate Jesus. Because if all these kids that want to start startups, they go read 400-page books of Steve Jobs' biography because he made the iPod, right?
Yeah.
And Pixar. Jesus split time. Mm-hmm. You want to be a leader? You want to be a leader? Go study a real leader who can split time, my friend.
Yeah.
He's that important. He didn't create Pixar. He created things like the modern hospital, the biggest empires. Even if they used his name wrongly, they were still trying to get his magic juju juice, just like you're trying to get Steve Jobs' juju juice by reading his biography to get some of that essence of badassness, right? So go and study the real master of history. And so whether you're religious or not, you should be studying every aspect of Jesus' life. And remember, don't let theology gate your Jesus. Because Jesus says that he's the Son of Man more than he says he's the Son of God. If he's the Son of Man, that means you should take an anthropological perspective to what Jesus is doing if you want to get a sincere and accurate depiction of what he's actually doing. If you keep it as a theology only, you're going to get a disembodied deity, just like every other pagan god. Just like every ideology, by the way. So ideology doesn't give you choice. Just like pagan gods don't give you choice. It's tit for tat. You submit to me, and I give you a prescription of how to do. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what ideology does. Ideology says, submit your mind to the hive mind dogmas of this and get to work. Just no patience, just do it. And what Christianity does, what imitating Jesus does, is it gives you a choice. Do you save the Good Samaritan or not? It doesn't give you an ideological command that says you must do this, you must do this. It gives you how to think.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't tell you what to think. It gives you how to think, how to process these moments in our lives in the way that Jesus processed them. So Christianity gives us a radical choice.
I'm with you. I'm with you. How do you, I don't know if it's appropriate to always come to that. How do you scale an awakening about what Christ really is in people? How do you get through, the idea of, Christ built the world, but if the world is failing, the institutions are failing, the economy is corrupt and oppressive, they will attribute that because it's bored into their heads, the mass majority of people, that is the problem, not the problem in the human heart. It's the problem of following Jesus when it's the exact opposite. And I don't know that absent grace and the Holy Spirit, you can have that understanding and that metanoia, that shift on a collective level. And maybe it's not even, that's not even the point, because I'm with you heart to heart, but I can also see and remember myself in a space where I could be told these exact same things, but they wouldn't mean what they mean to me now because it's so obvious now, and I've seen it in my life and others' life, but I don't know how to transfer that, other than being the example from a massive or scaling situation, which is something that I'm interested in. But
well, how did Jesus get people to believe in his message? What did he do?
He did a lot. He asked questions. He was crucified ultimately, right?
Yeah. So, well, that's what nobody wants to do. That we don't want to get on the cross, but you're going to be persecuted. You're going to be scapegoated if you do the right thing. But before that, let's try to keep it even more simple. What did he do most of his time on earth when he was in his ministry? He was healing people.
Yeah.
So people are like, why should I believe you? You just asked me that. You're like, why? How do we get people to believe Jesus? So his people would come to him and like, why should we believe you're the real deal? And he'd heal someone. So my theory is the church, being his body on earth today, should be healing diseases in the name of Jesus Christ. Like take out cancer for real and take out these diseases and heal the earth, heal pollution, create energy too cheap to meter, create low energy nuclear reaction, whatever it is, LNR. That's just one example. I'm giving you two things: cure cancer and cure pollution and create energy too cheap to meter so that we don't have to be stuck on a grid that's so predatorial.
I think that's possible. And it's not going to be anything like where you think of as a church or what the church is. Like it's going to be something new, for that to happen. And I think it's in the process of trying to happen with a lot of forces trying to keep that from happening. Those forces are disintegrating. You're seeing the death throes in terms of media, in terms of divisiveness. It's like this because they're at the end of their life. This organism is at the end of its life, right? And these new ways that are out there, they're out there for curing cancer, of fixing the problem with pollution and environmental issues.
So why do people?
A lot of the issues on the left are exactly what Christianity is right. At its core.
And the left's answer is a fundamentalist, fervent belief in the state to sacrificially right the wrongs of scarcity.
Yep.
Right. So
day in day out,
the two biggest things they have is pollution, energy scarcity issues related to global climate change or whatever, and then the health stuff. So you've got energy and health, right? So what has to happen is, men have to step up. People who don't believe in violent brutality like the state does, they're retarding knowledge by their monopolistic intrusion into these sectors of health and energy. They say they're going to progressively liberate us, but they're just retarding our ability to solve these problems ourselves. Mm-hmm. So Christian men have to step up to the plate and say, okay, we're going to work that much harder to compete in the free space of private capital, philanthropic donation, whatever it is, to go and do the experimentations, to go and do the information necessary to get the true solutions for energy and medicine and health into the public consciousness. That's what we have to do, because I believe that will function just like Jesus did. He heals his neighbors, and that gives them the space to believe that he truly is the real deal. And we need to do that too. Because what did Girard say? Do we imitate Jesus? right? We're supposed to imitate Jesus. Did Jesus spend most of his time healing the material problems and needs of his community? Yes, he did. He didn't give everybody a brand new car like Price is Right, but he was dealing with people's problems with scarcity, and the ultimate scarcity issue is scarcity of life.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you can heal people of bad diseases, and you can heal people of their fear that the planet's going to destroy with climate change, and if you can heal people from having to send their kids off to war to protect Saudi oil fields, then you've really shown the power of Christ in our time. And that's what people will be attracted to. I think that's what we should be doing. And also defending victims from the mob of every type. And I summarize that as no victim, no crime, okay? No victim, no crime. What's that?
Without becoming the accuser.
Right. That's why I tell people you can't scapegoat the state, because the state is a mirror of us. Right? You can't escape. The state is not an alien entity that is subjugating us and just tearing us apart. No, it's a reflection of our culture. It's a reflection of who we are, the crowd, you know?
Yeah. I
so
can agree.
So it's not like they're an alien entity that we just eliminate all the state people and all of a sudden we'll be perfectly fine. That's what some libertarians think, that the state's some kind of stupid, irrational thing that just has to be dismantled and we'll all be fine. No, that's not correct. The state is a reflection of thousands of years of anthropological development in human species. So you can't just like that make it go away. But you have to be able to create alternatives that make it outdated, right? You know what I mean?
And aren't we individually mirrors ourselves?
Yeah.
Aren't we individually reflections of what we desire? Right. That's at the highest level. That's going to incorporate itself or become the state. It has no other way. So at the core, we have to change what, like you said, at the very core, we are a mirror of the object we're desiring. You know, Girard has his triangle, right? The subject, the model, and the object. And what we're doing is reflecting the model. If the model is keeping up with the Joneses, we're going to have consumer capitalism, and that is going to end badly, right?
But the consumerist issue is because the people, you were talking about all this advertising stuff, that's because we have a Federal Reserve system.
Mm-hmm.
It pumps all this artificial credit, which is then geared towards consumption because the name of the game is to get people in debt. So if we had an actual free market, you couldn't just have unlimited credit. 16-year-old kids wouldn't be getting credit cards all the time in the mail. So all this stuff that's laid at the feet of capitalism, it goes back to my first point. We want to criminalize differentiation, and capitalism is differentiation. Because capitalism says private contract and private property and private holding of capital. And so we've been trained by this Western victimist mindset to scapegoat capitalism because it's another example of differentiation, which we find to be an oppressive construct. But it's not necessarily evil. It's not at all evil. It's beautiful. Because
not capitalism, consumer, late stage consumer capitalism, where we're
not late stage. It's cronyism. It's corporatism.
Yes, absolutely. But what do? We consume. We continue to buy things we don't need at and that gives us a semblance of.
But you couldn't do that if we had honest money. If we had gold and silver, if we had competing currencies, whatever it is that you want. I'm not on one or the other. If you had competing currencies with money actually backed by something. Then you couldn't have unlimited credit to get people. And so therefore Madison Avenue would not be flush with so much cash. You see what I mean? Our economy is rigged towards consumerism because of the artificial credit system of the Federal Reserve, which is a plank of the Communist Manifesto. So how in the world does this have anything to do with a free market? It has nothing to do with the free market.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with capital. It has everything to do with the opposite of capital, which is debt.
Yeah.
So their whole thing is all about, it's all a lie. It's all a design. So what they do, they scapegoat us. They tell us, sir, ma'am, you have too much freedom. That's why you're addicted to consumerism. We're going to snip some of your freedom more because you're the problem. And so we get ourselves to scapegoat the average person's freedom for the sins of the opposite of freedom, which is a monopoly on the issuance of credit and the price of money, which is what the Federal Reserve does when they set interest rates. That's the price of money. They're fixing the price of money. And they're doing so in a way that moves our economy towards investment in production and saving and towards consumerism and debt. Mm-hmm. And then they've convinced us to say, oh my God, it's because we have capital. It's because we have a free market. No, they're scapegoating you so they can strip more of your liberty so they can keep you in debt. It's a lie.
Yep.
Don't be ashamed of capital. Capital is what God wants. You save money. That's a godly person. There's nothing wrong with privately saving your money.
I think it's I made a video about this, capitalism in the light of Genesis, right? So what is capital? It's left over when you produce something, it creates profit. It creates something more. When you put human energy towards something, you create something. It's the process of creation, right? And that is what capital is. Capital means the head. So you're creating stuff. What you do with that stuff that you create is, that's the thing. That's the issue. Are you reinvesting it? What are you putting that capital into? What are you investing into, right? And that's where I think I agree with you 100%. It's been perverted, and it's been, turned around on us, that this process of creation that's created all this wealth and prosperity is itself the problem, not what's done from that. And again, it's another way I don't like to blame the boomers, but for these small number of people to keep onto as much money as possible for as long as they can before they die. That's what it comes down to in some sense, but I'm not scapegoating them.
Well, very good. James, it's been a pleasure talking to you. It's been a good discussion. I think hopefully this will be helpful for folks who are reading I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. We didn't actually reference the book too much explicitly, but we were basically in our conversation providing a foundation that comes naturally from having read the book, right?
Yeah, man. Appreciate it. Had a great talk.
Take care.